What's up, YouTube? This is the 82 and 0 podcast. Continuing on. So, one topic I wanted to cover was Len Bias. And I'm not really going to get into his individual biography in this video like I usually do with other players. This is just kind of a what if. So, for those of you who don't know, Leonard Bias was born November 18th, 1963, and he grew up in Maryland. He would grow up in Northwestern Maryland, and he would have a pretty good high school career before he would go to Maryland State from 82 to 86. Now, he's considered one of the greatest college players of that era. You know, one of the most complete, well-rounded players. So, like I said, I don't want to get too much into his biography. This is just a what if. What if Bias had lived? Now, for those of you who don't know, he was drafted to the Boston Celtics. And many of you may be wondering how the Boston Celtics pulled off getting this high of a draft pick when they were so good back then. Well, what happened was they traded Gerald Henderson to the Seattle Supersonics for a 1986 first-round draft pick. And that pick ended up being the second pick. So they would get Len Bias out of this draft. And for those of you who don't know, Bias had a lot of comparisons to Michael Jordan. And I don't know if this is like people talking afterwards, because you know how sometimes when there's a tragedy, unfortunately sometimes people will blow stuff out of proportion, like all of a sudden they're the greatest. I don't know if that's why people rank him that high, but we do know he was a very well-rounded player. Obviously, Brad Daugherty was the only player drafted above him in that draft. He had a really good collegiate career. So his first year there, averaged 7 points. Okay, not much, but by his senior year, or his fourth year, I should say, he put up 23.2 points per game, 7 rebounds, and he shot 54%. He was a very athletic player, quick on his feet. He would have had to develop a jump shot, I think, had he played in the NBA, which I don't think is an issue if you're a player with a great work ethic. But he was an All-American player in his junior year, and he led the Atlantic Coast Conference in scoring and was named the ACC's Player of the Year. His senior season was highlighted by his performance in an overtime victory against the top-ranked North Carolina, in which he scored 35 points, including 7 in the last 3 minutes of regulation and 4 in overtime. At the end of the year, Bias collected his second ACC Player of the Year award and was named to 2 All-American teams. Bias impressed basketball fans with his amazing leaping ability and his physical stature and his ability to create plays, and was considered the most dynamic player of the nation that year. By his senior year, scouts of the various teams in the NBA viewed Bias as the most complete forward in the class of 1986. And Celtics scout Ed Badger called Bias an explosive kind of player, and he compared him to Michael Jordan. Now, here's what I think would happen. Because the Boston Celtics, they came out, this is their final championship in the 80s. 85-86 was their final championship in the 80s, I should say. And the team just kind of fell apart after this. It's unfortunate because they won in 81, 84, and 86. And let's talk about this 86 team. I've talked about them a lot on this channel. They're one of the greatest teams in NBA history. They went 67-15, the first best defensive rated and the third best offensive rated. And they have the best home record in NBA history. They won the championship, and that offseason is when they drafted Len Bias. And so the following season, although they'd win 59 games, they lost in the NBA Finals. I don't know if Bias would change the outcome of 87, because I don't know if he'd make an immediate impact. And it's going to be impossible to guess these things. But in 87-88, the Boston Celtics would lose in the conference finals. They wouldn't make it back to the finals after this. And Bird was starting to have back problems. And the team would get older. Like I said, they started falling apart. Kevin McHale was there. He had injuries, too. I think he had a broken foot or something like that. By the 88-89 season, they would lose in the first round, winning, and they only won 42 games that year, and Bird only played 6 games. And by the 90 season, they won 52 games. I'm just kind of giving an overview so you know kind of what was going on with this team. And by that season, Bird was kind of bouncing back. He averaged 24, 9, and 7. But 90-91, they won 56 games. Larry Bird his numbers would decline. 91-92 would be Bird's final year, and they won 51 games. Now, you're probably wondering why I'm covering that. Like, why am I going in depth? Well, you got to understand, the reason I'm talking about this is put Len Bias in this situation. Let's say the hype around him was true. Let's say Len Bias was this generational talent. And it's impossible to guess what kind of player he'd be. But let's say I'm not going to say play style like Jordan, but let's say he comes in and makes an impact like that. How would these years differ? Because, like I mentioned, the team, they dealt with injuries and stuff. But let's say he was able to pick up the slack of Bird when Bird was hurt, and McHale. Do you think, like I said, I don't think they would have won 87, but do you think they would have made it back to the finals, maybe, say, 91, where they won 56 games? Because by then, let's say Len Bias is a 28-point-per-game scorer, and you're putting him on a team with Bird, Reggie Lewis, McHale was still there, Robert Parrish was still there. Are they going to be able to defeat the Bulls? Would they be able to challenge the Bulls? And by 91-92, Bird's last year, and they won 51 games that year, this team already had 2 20-point-per-game scorers, Reggie Lewis and Larry Bird. How does Len Bias work into this equation? And here's kind of my prediction. I think he's the type of player, because he based his game on athleticism. He would have had to develop a jump shot, like I said. I think he would have been a good defender. And here's what I picture. I picture him to be just from the hype I've read, okay? I didn't live in this era. It's really, really hard to predict this stuff. But here's my guess, all right? And if somebody disagrees, that's totally fine, because it's all speculation. I think he would have got to be anywhere from as high as the second best player in the league. I don't think he would have been better than Jordan. I just don't think that. And I think he could have been as low as maybe the 5th best player, during his prime. So I think they theoretically by 90-91, or maybe even 90, but I'm going to go with 91, I think they could have challenged the Bulls during this time. And this would have helped Bird, as Bird was in pain. Bird, as much pain as he was in, he was still dropping like 20 points per game. So you put him into this equation, he has somebody to give him some leeway. Kind of like similar, I know it's not the same, but think about like Kawhi Leonard in 2014 with the Spurs. He was able to pick up some of the slack on Tim Duncan's end when Duncan was getting older. I'm not saying Duncan had fallen off completely, but I'm saying he was able to carry the load a little bit. So I could see them possibly winning a championship in the early 90s. But let's say, Bird retires and everything. how would they rebuild in the 90s? Like the mid to late 90s? That's the tough part to predict because, by 91, 92, Bird was gone. And they had a lot of bad seasons after that. Like 94, they won 32 games. 95, they won 35 games. By 97, they won 15 games. How first of all, how long would Len Bias play? I could see him playing from like 87, that would have been his rookie season, 86, 87, up to like, let's say, maybe like 2003, 2004. And you kind of got to factor into how does this affect the Celtics draft history? Are they still going to be able to draft Paul Pierce? Probably not. Because let's say the Celtics were good or even even average, right? Even if they're average because of him, because of Len Bias playing with them, they're not going to be able to get high draft picks. So this changes the whole landscape of this team. Because Paul Pierce was the 10th pick in 98. They also had picks like Chauncey Billups, who was the 3rd pick, Antoine Walker, who was the 6th pick. I'm just naming like some better known players that they picked during this time. Would they get these guys? Probably not. Maybe so. You never know. But here's how I see it playing out. Like I said, the Celtics probably win a championship in the early 90s. Len Bias is probably looked at as, like I said, top 2, top 5 player in the league. And not only that, does he take a championship away from Jordan? Does he win one in 91? That would take away one of Jordan's rings if that happens. Or who knows, man? Maybe he would be able to get free agents to come to Boston to play with him. So, does he impact the legacy? You got to think about this. If he's a generational player, does he impact the legacy of guys in the 90s? Does he take away any of Jordan's rings? Does he take away any of Jordan's MVPs? Or even in the mid-90s, let's say he wins in 94. Does he take away Hakeem's legacy? This is something that's kind of hard to predict and something that's fun to think about if there was a generational talent during this time period that didn't exist. Like, he passed away. But my honest prediction is I don't think, it's impossible to predict. I don't think the Celtics would have been able to get it done past 92, I'd say. Their window of winning, I'd say, winning a championship would be 88 to 92, That because they still had that core together and they had Bias. And I don't know if the way the culture was back then, there wasn't all this player movement. How many guys are going to come play with him? And if he's a great player, is the team going to be not bad, but just average? Then, like I said, they're not getting Paul Pierce. They're not getting Billups. I don't think they're going to win anything after that. I think he'll be like in a situation like a Reggie Miller. Like, he might play his entire career with Boston. Who knows? Maybe the organization will be able to make some good sign-ins, some good trades, and maybe he could make another finals run. But I do think he would have been a Hall of Famer had he survived, had he lived. And it's tragic to think about that a player died this young. He was only 22 years old, and he was 6'8", 210. Crazy, crazy good athlete. He would have been amazing. And also I think here's another impact that I don't think people talk about enough. I was talking about how would he impact players' legacies on the court. What about off the court? Because he had an endorsement with Reebok. What if, I'm just saying, this is just all speculation, what if he would have been a marketable star like a Jordan during the 90s, Would we be wearing Bias shoes today? This is just stuff to think about. We don't know how good he would have been. So that's just my prediction. Let me know what you guys think down below. Thanks for watching.